right, welcome everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Chris Berry. I'm the faculty director of the Mansueto Institute. Really pleased to see you all here to the first of our colloquium for the year. And I'm thrilled to be able to introduce our speaker for today, Matthew Saniie, who is currently an urban leader in residence at the Mansueto Institute. So he's around if you'd like to spend more time with him, which you surely will after you hear his talk. Matthew is a real leader in government technology, particularly in the criminal justice space. And what he seeks to do is transform how government uses data to create more effective and transparent justice systems. He was the inaugural Chief Data and Technology Officer for the Cook County State's Attorney's Office right here. In that capacity, he created the nation's first case-level open data initiative for any prosecutor's office. Through that, he made over 300,000 cases and 45 million data points publicly available, and that data is now used by the Marshall Project, John Jay's College Data Collaborative for Justice, and the Chicago Tribune and other journalists. He's presently working on research funded by the Arnold Foundation, where he's examining the data infrastructure in other prosecutors' offices around the country, and he's interested in identifying technical, legal, and organizational barriers that prevent criminal justice data sharing. A bit of tidbit for us, those at the university, is that Matthew got his start actually as the senior battleground states election analyst in the Barack Obama's 2012 presidential campaign. His work has been featured in the New York Times, the New Yorker, Bloomberg, the Tribune, all kinds of places. And as a shameless plug, I'll say again, as a urban practitioner in residence at Mansueto, Matthew will lead a hackathon in a couple of weeks, November 7th, to any student at the university is eligible, where he's going to show you how to use these data, the kind of data that he's created for the state's attorney's office, to analyze and ask your own questions. So you'll get hands-on experience with that. And we're having a webinar, kind of a primer on that on Wednesday. So if you're interested in getting to spend more time with Matthew, work with his data, get your hands on it and learn how to use it, you're going to have these opportunities coming up while he's here. So without further ado, I welcome Matthew to come and speak with us. Whoa.
Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you everyone for being here. I hope this turns out to be worthwhile for you. I'm excited to kind of talk to you a bit about the work I did at the State's Attorney's Office. So as Chris said, I was the inaugural Chief Data Officer there. I actually, as far as I know, am the first Chief Data Officer within any prosecutor's office, both in the United States and actually outside the United States. I looked in European countries and such to try to find some type of analogous role and really didn't find anything. You know, my research might not have been as thorough as it could be, but didn't have any model to build off of. So really, my experience was greenfield, but it was greenfield on an office that was nearly 200 years old, and on a practice that was nearly 4,000 years old. From there, you know, I was kind of taking new methodologies and trying to apply it to this traditional practice. That was driven by lawyers, which if there are any lawyers in the room, you're probably not the most technology-driven, data-driven folks as a whole. That people don't generally go into law because they have a passion for technology and data. To level set a little bit, I think it's important to kind of talk a little bit about the starting point for just this role existing within the office, as well as kind of why I was brought into this office. So my boss was State Attorney Kim Fox. She was elected initially in the election in 2016, took office in December of 2016. She ran on a pledge to create open and transparent data. This pledge was actually pushed by Shy Hackney as a whole. They went to every candidate and asked them to commit to this, and she was one of the candidates that was willing to do it. It was instrumental in the work that she wanted to see in the office. You know, criminal justice in Chicago has had lots of challenges, and one of the biggest challenges is degradation of trust between the communities and those that are implementing justice. And so, you know, that rebuilding of trust is a very tedious process. And data transparency is one element that can help build that. And so that was one of her major motivations for it. So this is the goal that she set out for me. And that this piece of paper actually was written the day I started in that office, and I pinned it to my board, and it's hung up there until the last day I was there. But it was literally to be the most open and transparent prosecutor's office in the country. If you're interested in learning more about that transparency and how that came about, again, Chris mentioned on Wednesday, we're gonna do an information session. I'm gonna touch base a little bit on transparency in this talk, but it's not actually the focus of it. We did a lot of really cool things. Like he said, we published the richest open data set that's ever really been published by a prosecutor's office. It's still there. It it was used to help articulate the work we were doing, and it was also used to hold us accountable and call the work that we were doing into question, which I think that's actually a good sign of a public service tool that you're putting out there, that it's not just something slanted to make you look good, that it actually has the opportunity to have real rich debate around it. And that's, again, something that we can talk more about this Wednesday, and then again on November 7th, there's a hackathon. But what I'm going to start talking about is some of the analysis that we did and kind of where this came from. So this headline was published on Fox News, which was the same Fox News that exists today as far as the type of rhetoric and headlines they like to run. And this showed up about 3 months into me joining the office. And basically, the office wanted to kind of be like, okay, what are we doing about this, right? And so literally, I got asked this question: what are we doing about carjackings? And at this time, in my experience, right, I didn't know the difference between finding a probable cause and a true bill. And maybe folks don't know what that is in this room, but I was real nascent in just understanding the criminal justice system. And now I have to articulate, what are we doing about carjackings, right? Like, they're asking me, right? I'm 2.5 months old in this job, right? Like, literally there because I really liked Kim Fox. I thought she was, pretty smart, and she was a reformer, right? And so like that approach to the policy side of it, and I had some data skills and some technology skills. And so they're asking me to answer this question. And so, spent probably 3-4 days trying to wrap my head around it. And this is actually the result of the very first analysis I did at that office. It's not the full code that I wrote, but you can see, about 100 lines of SQL was written to manipulate the data that I had access to. And this little table was here to explain what was going on with carjackings, right? Now, without diving too much into this, the first thing you'll notice is this analysis doesn't include the phrase carjacking anywhere in it, right? And that was the first hurdle to kind of take something that was colloquially used in the language, in the press headline, and figure out how to take the information that we had and say, okay, this is what's going on with carjackings. And so what we ended up looking at was, how are we charging cases related to carjackings? Which one of the decision points our office gets to make is whether or not we want to charge someone with a felony crime, and then what crime they would be charged with. And then the types of cases we thought would be related to carjackings were PSMV, which is possession of stolen motor vehicle, which, if you carjack someone, you end up with a motor vehicle in your possession that may not be yours. And then ag vehicle hijacking, which is actually fairly similar language-wise to carjackings, but it could actually also include a boat. Fortunately, we don't have that many pirates in Chicago hijacking boats, but we kind of had to take that and figure that out. And then you can see in this analysis that we looked at the approval rates, the rates that we were saying, okay, we see a felony crime here that we feel confident that we could charge. And you'll notice that here in 2017, we see that on PSMVs, the charge rate was declining. Now, that may be because we changed something, that may be because the quality of the cases, we didn't know exactly, but we could see that trend was happening. And then you can see that the approval rate on ag vehicle hijacking was actually pretty high, 95%, right? So, a little bit of a mixed bag. Like, maybe we're being tougher on this, maybe we're being softer on it, we don't quite know, right? And then you kind of see baseline numbers of how often these cases are being brought to us, right? We don't get to decide who gets arrested. We just get to receive the cases that got the arrest that took place and the cases that are presented to us. this was the first problem, right? And it helped me reinforce this realization that is very true in the world of data. Counting is the hardest thing we do. And this is something that, like, in the world of data, coming back to over and over again, you're going to have to do this. And I actually have a little girl, she's going to be 2 in 2 weeks. And one of the most amazing things about her is she now can count over 10. And I haven't taught her how to count. My wife hasn't taught her how to count. She's kind of figured it out on her own, and she just points at things, goes 1, 2, 3, gets to 11, 12, kind of gets lost at 12, right? So at some level, counting is super elemental, right? And so, like, this kind of seems like a crazy statement to make. But I'll show you exactly how we unpack this and how difficult counting is. So, word problem, right? So in this word problem, a stolen motor vehicle was discovered. 3 individuals were arrested related to it, right? One was in the driver's seat and charged with felony PSMV, right? Possession of stolen motor vehicle. One was in the passenger seat, had a gun, and was charged with felony UUW, unlawful use of a weapon, is what that stands for. One was seen running, arrested, and not charged with a crime. The PSMV case pled to a guilty conviction charge. The UUW case was diverted, and the accused completed the program without receiving a conviction. So now we need to count this, right? What actually took place so we can put it in aggregate, right? This is the anecdote. Now, how do we get to the aggregate? How many cases were reviewed? How many were approved? How many were prosecuted? How many were convicted, right? How do we define those numbers so that we can actually start to tell a story, not just about this case, but about the 30,000 cases our office handled every year to show whether or not we were actually doing what the community was entrusting us to do. So the answer in this example, right, and the way we kind of thought about this, and you know, this was an internal conversation that we had, not because the decisions we were making were going to make the numbers look one way or another, but because we thought that this decision was the most defensible and was the easiest to understand, while all options were kind of confusing given that word problem, if that makes sense, right? And we were very transparent about this, but a single case was reviewed in this example, right? And this is based upon an incident, right, being brought to us, whether 1, 2, 3, 8 people were arrested, right? Tied to that single incident, right? Again, right? Sometimes, you know, we have accomplices and things of that nature, right? So we looked at it as one case, right? Interestingly enough, possession of firearms, a single gun could try to be tied to 3 people, right? Which, like, the construct of possession actually means that one person has to have possession of it. So if I possess it, you can't possess it by the sheer nature of me possessing it, if that kind of makes sense in that sense. So, you know, this kind of this idea of one incident applying to multiple people for the review process is kind of where that came from. Then, if any of the defendants on that, or the accused in this case, were approved on it, we considered that case actually approved, right? Now, if 3 people were approved, we didn't say, hey, we approved 3 cases, right? We just counted it as 1 case. If no one was approved, if no one was essentially, we felt that was accused could be convicted of a crime that we thought took place, then we consider that case rejected or not approved. Once charges were filed, we then looked at everyone who had felony charges filed on them, and that actually starts its own separate case. Because in Cook County in particular, defendants go into court essentially by themselves, even if they have accomplices. And, you know, you all probably watched Law and Order, where an individual, you know, testifies against his accomplice or her accomplice, and then they, you know, get more evidence on that person and all that fun stuff. That happens in general, not everyday type stuff, but does happen in general. And so this is like a single case could split into multiple cases. And then, as far as the construct of prosecuted is, seeing that case out so that there's some type of resolution on that case was what we considered prosecution, right? And so from that standpoint, we charged it, now we prosecute it. That resolution could be a trial, could be a plea, could be a diversion program, but that was work that our attorneys had to do to kind of see the outcome of it, right? And again, this process of just defining things, right? Sitting down and kind of getting that alignment from the executive team, right? On down through middle management and such was very difficult to do. And actually, when I came into the office, they were keeping regular stats on what was happening in the office and how it was happening. And they were all being hand counted by individuals throughout the county, actually, throughout the office. We have 1,200 people in our office. And the definitions that were being used actually varied. And what they would do is they type a number in for the one, like at the end of the month, like, okay, we did 15 of these, right? And then they'd send that spreadsheet off to someone else and that would add it up to someone that said they did 23 of these. But the way 23 was counted and the way 15 was counted would have different definitions because there was no standardization. And then they were aggregated to make some large number that suggested something was happening without actually understanding all the underpinnings of it, right? And so this was a big process of just building out the infrastructure to allow us to be able to count. Again, something very simple, right? So we kind of talked about this aspect of it and really thinking about it. There are other challenges, right, with this type of data. And this, just the unit is the first piece of it, but you've got categories, right? I use the carjacking example. So we have carjackings, right? Ag vehicle hijacking. We also have a type of case called vehicle hijacking. They're slightly different. Ag tends to have a weapon involved. Non-aggravated. I threw a fist at someone. I pulled him out of the car, but I didn't actually have a weapon that I brandished. We had possession of a stolen motor vehicle. I may have stolen the car, I may not have, but we don't actually know how it was stolen. I just happened to have the car, right? And I got caught in it. And then we actually have something called criminal trespassing to vehicle, which is actually a very low level offense. But if the vehicle is parked and I am, checking the handle, maybe it's open, I can like hotwire and steal it, but I haven't actually stolen it yet and it's not moving. Now I've just trespassed into a motor vehicle, which is a different level of charge. And so just thinking that construct of carjackings and then all the different pieces that can feed into it had to define that out. So that one's a fairly easy one. One that we got constantly asked about, right? Understandably so, is violence, right? What are we doing about violent crime? How are we prosecuting violent crime, right? So what is a violent crime? It was a big question that we had to answer that took a lot of debate and discussion, right? Armed robbery, right? I don't know if folks understand the definition of what robbery is, but it's forcibly taking away something from someone. So if I put a weapon at you and say, hey, give me your purse, right? That's armed robbery to some extent, or give me cash from the register or whatever the case may be. I can also forcibly just take your purse from you as well, rob you, right? Without having to have a weapon. That's also violent in its nature. Burglary, right? Burglary is a case where someone goes into a home, right, into a business and takes something from it. Inherently, it doesn't sound violent, right? But if you've ever been burglarized, right, you've had a break-in and entry, right? Maybe you were asleep, maybe you're on vacation, maybe you were just, out. You feel very violated. And there is a threat of someone being in your home that actually like gets to your core at the end of the day. So burglary ended up being considered violent in our definition. Theft. Theft is just someone grabbed my laptop and walked out of here. That's theft, right? Like I left it, I wasn't paying attention to it. That one was not violent. So what we would consider property crimes normally, actually most of them ended up being violent. Earlier I talked about unlawful use of a weapon, right? And so unlawful use of a weapon sounds like someone used a weapon unlawfully, right? So, weapons, tools of violence, and now it's a tool that I would use against someone. Well, what unlawful use of a weapon actually is possessing a weapon without the proper credentials. It's actually the equivalent of a clerical error to some degree or another, right? Your license isn't right, or you have a license, but you're storing the item in the incorrect way in a public space. And so, what people might think is violent actually isn't violent. And this is one of the biggest things that we actually, we ended up having to have lots of conversations around. Guns are a big deal in Cook County and Chicago. I don't want to downplay it. Gun violence is actually a big deal in America, unfortunately, right? So definitely not downplaying gun violence. But the same behavior in Chicago that would get to an unlawful use of a weapon charge, if done 20 miles in Indiana, no crime was committed. Like they're actually considered a Second Amendment advocate, right? Defending their God-given rights, a patriot, if you will. And so from that standpoint, right, the way that we use language really does define how we see things. The other aspect of this was timing, right? So people want to know what happened last week, last year, last month. And, our average court case ended up taking on average 2 years, right? So that's a big amount of time. And that, sometimes incident happens, an arrest doesn't happen for 2, 3, 4 months afterward, right? Sometimes a case gets charged and then for technicalities, you have to recharge it, to add charges to it, or remove charges to it. This becomes a complicated time sequencing problem, right? And so we had to figure out ways to kind of anchor to the appropriate dates when we were grouping cases together, right? And talking about it. So just kind of thinking about it, in our world, right, every definition is a choice to what justice actually means. And this is, I went into data because I was good with numbers. I was actually like bad at English. I did poor on my English side of my SAT, but so much of the work actually is language, right? And that language that we wrap around the numbers that we're showing shapes how we see the world as a whole. And so in this case, language became justice. All right. So this is kind of the cycle that existed in our world that drove our analysis initially, right? I showed you that 2.5 months into my job, all of a sudden I'm getting hit with this Fox News report saying, what are we doing about carjackings? How can we explain what we're doing about carjackings? So what is happening here is incident takes place, right? It gets a headline or multiple headlines. From that, a couple things happen. They all generally happen in kind of unison. Public becomes aware of something. They start asking questions. Totally understandable, right? Media becomes more aware about it. They're trying to get the bigger story, right? They start asking questions. Both the public and the media go to other elected officials, right? Not even our office, start asking questions, right? Plus, the elected official sees that headline and is trying to get out in front of it. And so all of this gets kind of funneled back into us. And now we have to do data analysis about whatever the latest headline is out there. And this, is a prime example of how that played out while we were there. So these are two headlines about crime that took place the day before on August 9th. 2020, August 9th, right? We had a lot of civil unrest, often tied to George Floyd, a little bit tied to just COVID and the challenges that are happening there. A lot of looting on Michigan, right? Big deal, like stores, businesses, right? It's a beautiful part of Chicago. We definitely want to, take care of it. So this happens, right? This first article is gets published at, 10:51 a.m. The second article is 7 hours later, right? That's how fast that cycle moves, right? And, this isn't actually a value statement on Lori Lightfoot, right? She's in a position trying to say what's she doing to keep the city safe as much as State Attorney Fox is in a position to say what she's trying to do to keep the city safe. And because State Attorney Fox was a reformer, it made her easy to point to and say, hey, like, what are you, like, it's got to be her fault, right? Like, she's not doing it. So as a result of this, we ended up having to figure out how to talk about looting cases, right? Again, there are no looting crimes out there, right? There are no statutes that said you looted, right? We talked about burglary, right? We talked about robbery. We talked about theft. Those are the types of crimes, right? Breaking and entering is another one that's related to looting, but not necessarily looting. So we ended up building an internal dashboard that identified cases that were looting related. These were the cases that were brought to us on August 9th. We had 100 cases brought to us, 97 of them were approved and charged as felonies. And the 3 of them that weren't, you can see the small note down here, is the police officers that brought us the cases actually agree with our decision, right? So the anecdote about what our office was doing or not doing related to these type of cases didn't hold up to the actual data, right? And so, this is kind of that responsive aspect of it. Now, it was great we were able to do things like that, right? But this led us to this question, how can we get in front of this, right? Because, so much of that work had us on our heels trying to figure out how to actually talk about the work we were doing, how to paint a picture, how to articulate the great work that was really not being done by the executive team, right? But actually done by about 800 ASAs working every day, talking to victims, looking at fact sheets and making serious determination about public safety. So what we ended up developing was something like this. Actually was this by the end. So this is a screenshot, and I'll walk you through kind of the whole screenshot of it. But this is part of a memo that got generated. This was the very last memo we generated. This looked at 8 years of work under the Fox administration. And we showed things such as all the cases brought to us for review and how many of those cases we approved. Pretrial detention was something that changed under the Fox administration. It was part of a legislative effort done across the state of Illinois, but we wanted to show those numbers. They're relatively small because it hadn't been in place that long, about a year, but we wanted to show those numbers as well. At the bottom, you see overall prosecution, and we actually split it out by overall prosecution and then prosecution by cases filed by our office. In Cook County, narcotics cases are direct filed by law enforcement, and the approach to dealing with narcotics cases, as well by the courts as well as the prosecutors, has evolved drastically over the last 10 years, where now you're putting people into treatment opposed to in jail, generally speaking. So when you look, you can see conviction rate overall 79, 77, depending on what you're looking at. When we add in the narcotics cases, it drops about 15 points. So this was the second page, right? So the language that we were using was shaping how we were showing cases. So we wanted to make sure that we showed the top types of cases that we were dealing with. You'll notice that unlawful use of a weapon is the top type of case that we dealt with, right? That gun possession case. And happy to discuss like why gun possession cases are so prevalent in Chicago, but that was the #1 type of felony crime we were dealing with, right? And we were approving them at a very high rate and subsequently also convicting them at a very high rate. We also looked at things by race, right? Because again, race is so important within the criminal justice system, as well as just the history that the criminal justice system has had in Cook County and Chicago regarding race. This was another 2 pages that we had included on there. And so here we're looking at more detention breakdowns, and then the actual prosecution numbers by the different categories. You'll see that, again, narcotics was the top case that was being prosecuted by our office, but then UW is right underneath it. And then we ended up showing diversion as well. So the types of cases that were going into diversion, how often people were graduating, essentially completing diversion as intended, which meant that generally they would end up without a conviction and could kind of go back into society without that what am I trying to say? That scarlet letter, if you will, that could limit them and have access to certain things. And then we again showed diversion by race as well. At the end of this memo, and this is a 4-page memo, I just kind of broke up the first parts. We start showing incidences and arrests. And so during Kim Fox in Chicago, there were 2.1 million criminal incidences reported. Only 14% of them ended up with an arrest. So 86% of the people that committed crime that ended up getting reported never got arrested by anyone in Chicago. And then we start to break it down by different types of categories: top reported, top arrested, and then also by violent crime. And if we look at violent crime, homicide is the highest arrest rate at 35%. Arrest rate is also different than clearance rate, and happy to have a conversation about why we would use arrest rate over clearance rate. But we don't get to prosecute people who are accused of a crime and not arrested. And clearance rate allows you to accuse someone of a crime and not arrest them. And then it drops for domestic violence 18%, all the way down to reckless discharge of a firearm 4%. And so you can see that just the opportunity to involve prosecution on our most dangerous crimes was very limited during our tenure. For whatever reason, that's just, the numbers that they showed. Talked about how we were defining things earlier. We made sure to include all of that in a very lengthy footnote so that the transparency was there. And then at the bottom of everything, we allowed people to reach out to us directly to ask questions. And these memos that we were generating, right? We were generating them, and just to kind of back it up, we were giving them to elected officials. And the reason we're giving them to elected officials is because they're at the kind of the center of that firestorm that we were getting asked all sorts of questions, right? And as a result of that, it meant that now the elected officials had the most recent information of how we were charging things and what we were charging. And not only did we give them for Cook County and Chicago, but we gave them for their actual district. So if you were the alder person from Ward 34, you got numbers that showed us what we did in your ward for the last month. And you got that memo every single month for the last couple of years that we were there. So you could then say, like, if something happened, maybe we weren't holding, we weren't doing our job. But at the end of the day, what those memos showed over and over and over again was we were charging people and we were convicting people above 50% rates with the appropriate types of cases going into diversity programs as we expect. So we're not just measuring the system, we're teaching the public how to think about crime and justice. And this was really a big part of our work. You know, the idea that we don't arrest people was new to everyone, right? Like people assumed that we were out there, you know, kicking in doors and pulling the perp out, right? We weren't, right? And so, you know, this is how we kind of got out in front of it. And what allowed us to be able to build a memo like that was this. So it was happening behind the scenes, right? The analysis ended up being about 20% of the work that we did, and creating this environment was about 80%. And essentially, data infrastructure allows for self-awareness. I'm going to show that in a little bit of how not only were we able to get out in front and respond to individuals that had questions about our office or wanted to call in to question our work, but it allowed us to also better understand what we were doing, how we were doing it, and if it was what we intended to do. Just to kind of give you guys a quick sense of this diagram, this was our main hub that had all of our data in it, and we were pulling it from a bunch of different sources. Each one of these sources was both great and not great at the same time. All of this is what is classified as administrative data, right? It means that it's all entered by hand. It's prone to error. The people that are entering in this data are overworked. They're not giving great direction. This, by the way, includes data from our office, right? SAO, includes data from CPD, includes data from the sheriff's office. It wasn't wildly incorrect, right? It wasn't like you couldn't trust, you know, more than half of it. But we would see gaps, we would see things misspelled, we would see, you know, race not necessarily coded as we would expect by looking at last names, things of that nature. But we were able to take all that data, put it into a single repository. We were able to build memos, we were able to do analysis, we were able to get dashboards out there and get in front of things that were coming at us. So we moved off of our heels. So organizing and preparing your data for analysis is like cleaning a dirty mirror so you can see clearly. And like this, I firmly believe, right, that essentially if you want to use data to run your organization, whatever organization you're running, you essentially are trying to hold up a mirror to the work you're doing as you know, you leave the house and you want to see how you look before you enter into the world. And you know, this takes time. And that mirror by default in the kind of states that we're in is very dirty. It's, you know, a fragment here, a fragment there. It's got smudges on it. Someone put Vaseline on it. That makes it real difficult. And what you're doing is very unsexy, boring, challenging work that to get it to a good place. So they're kind of the three prerequisites for data intelligence, right? You got to find your assets, right? What data do we actually have? Can we get it? Can we improve it a little bit by getting people to enter it in better, right? It's really starting with what you have. Then it's what are your needs, right? Like I firmly believe that we don't do data for data's sake, right? You know, I don't want to write fancy algorithms that like can predict things that like don't actually help us understand the work we're doing in a meaningful way. So what is our actual need? What are we trying to do? And then finally, the language, right? How do we take our assets and bridge it to our needs? And that's all going to be driven by the language. And this leads to the broccoli, data governance. This is the most unsexy aspect of all data, and it is the most important critical work that has to happen. Otherwise, what you're putting out is just garbage, right? You need to have standard definitions. You need to have data quality checks. I was actually looking as I was preparing this to an old project tracker, and like literally like the first 5 projects were like looking at data quality issues, time sequencing issues, incongruentness in the different data sets to make sure that when I was pulling data, I had the best possible data. And then on top of it, you know, many times over again, I learned something about our data that wasn't disclosed to me at the beginning, and I had to rebuild things that I didn't want to rebuild because someone was keeping a secret from me that I finally found out from them, and I had to use it to improve our data. Things of access control, right? When you build a hub that has all this information in it, you want to make sure that it's well managed so that the wrong people aren't getting access to it. You need to have things documented so that folks know what they're looking at when I wasn't a team of one my whole time I was there. I built out a team underneath me. That documentation allowed people to come in and, within maybe 4 to 6 weeks, start running really fast using things that were built. Got to schedule data moving around that whole infrastructure, right? You got to know what those schedules are. You got to make sure they don't break. And then you want to make sure you have version control on everything, right? At the end of the day, as you come up with new ideas, you implement things, you try things, you want to make sure you don't lose the good work you've done prior to it, because what you're trying may not actually end up being the right way to go. But doing all of this allowed for incredible self-awareness within how we operated. And this is one example of that self-awareness. And so those in the back, what we're looking at is the jail population from March 1st through the end of 2020. So that was that first year of COVID. And again, I don't know how much folks remember COVID in Cook County, but the Cook County jail was a national hotspot. It was one of the most dangerous places to be. I think Sheriff Dart would talk about how he would strip down in his hazmat suit in his garage before walking into his house because that's how nervous we were about this, right? We were having multiple deaths in the jail. And, it's really hard to separate people when they're in jail. So our best hope was to essentially depopulate the jail as much as possible. And within a couple of weeks, we were able to depopulate it about 30%. And the way we were able to do that is because we had that infrastructure built out. We took data from the clerk's office, we took data from our system, we took data from the jail system, took data from CPD, and we built out a dashboard looking at those individuals, being able to rank them, right, on most likely that we think we can be released to least likely. And then we had a set of human eyes, a lawyer from our team and a lawyer from the public defender's team, review that information and make a decision, independent of each other, by the way, but they were able to look at the same information, right, off that same infrastructure. And every day, every morning, leadership from all these different offices could look and say, okay, we're at 5,500, now we're at 5,400, now we're at 5,300, until we got down to almost 4,000, right? And we were only able to get there because we had that infrastructure and we were able to finally now look at ourselves and say, okay, what can we do? What do we see in this mirror now that it's somewhat clean from before? Another example of this is looking at how we resolve cases where we nollie, which when you nollie a case, it means that you decide after you charge someone to no longer move forward with prosecution. There are lots of reasons that would happen. Completion of a diversion program would allow for that. But you may have a case fall apart. You may decide that, the witness doesn't want to, what they call the complaining witness, doesn't want to pursue charges anymore. So we looked at how often cases were being nollied and how often we were reducing felony cases down to misdemeanors, right? And then looking at that over time and then subsequently by the different types of categories. And this actually can be done with the open data, another plug for that open data come Wednesday, and you could build this yourself. And you can look at it, what it looks like in 2023 and 2024. But this allows us to see that violent gun cases, right? This was happening least frequently, right? While nonviolent gun cases, it was happening most frequently, about over half the time, right? And these are narcotics cases and things of that nature, right? Violent non-gun cases, right? So no gun, but violent, it was happening low. And then nonviolent gun cases, again, a possession case, which, could lead to something bad, but generally is often some type of lesser style case, was happening kind of the fourth highest. And you can even see that in 2020, there was an uptick, and particularly pronounced on the nonviolent non-gun cases. And again, this is related to COVID, clearing out the dockets, moving people that we thought we could move out of the court system as quickly as possible so they could avoid, reduce the risk of getting sick and potentially die. So, all public servants answer to the public. Data is how the public can hold them accountable. So, taking this kind of paradigm, right, and coming back to that original question, ask what is your carjacking question, right? If you're in transportation, what are you doing to reduce traffic congestion, right? If you're in health, what are you doing to deal with hospital overcrowding, right? If you're in education, what are we doing about graduation rates? Take that first question being asked, right? Look at that information that's available to it, prepare that information and provide insight analysis. And this becomes the way that you can go from asking questions of what is actually happening to getting a level of self-awareness within government or with whatever apparatus you're operating in. With that, I'll pause. Thank you. Questions? Yeah? Do we have a mic or do you want to shout? Okay.
This is an incredible presentation. The question I have is about sample selection, which I imagine is a huge problem with the data that you have. You're asked to produce estimates of, is violent crime going up or down?
Sure.
There's so many stages in the process where you could have selection, and it's also something that's very difficult to communicate to the public, how to account for these things.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if this is, a challenge that you encountered and what you did to address it.
Yeah. Oh, man. So it's tricky, right? And look, statistical significance, right, is not a subject matter that like anyone wants to talk about in a newspaper or in kind of general conversation, right? P-values are obtuse constructs that are very important, but also obtuse. We tried to not get into the prediction game, right? We tried not to overemphasize or underemphasize the problem that was happening with crime, right? If you are a victim of crime, the problem is huge. It's very acute. I can't downplay it, right? At the end of the day, but if we look at, what percentage of individuals end up becoming a victim of crime based upon the information we have, right? We know that, Chicago is actually like the 6th most violent city in Illinois, if you actually look at the numbers, and like not even in the top 10 in the country if you adjust the population. So we tried not to get in that space. There was a time during actually again COVID where gun violence went up, right? And this is something that we saw across the nation. But we're very sensitive to gun violence in Chicago, and again, understandably so. And so there was a lot of like, Kim Fox is responsible for this spike in gun violence. And basically, to help kind of articulate what was actually happening, kind of broke it apart from looking at aggregates and looked at just what was happening on a month-to-month basis and put that data back going to 1990s. And then looked for like essentially outliers in how in the recent months of like high spikes compared to 25 years of data, 20 years of data. And what we saw was there were a couple months that were really bad, and the other months actually like were kind of in what you would consider the net normal distribution. And so tried to help articulate that a little bit to reporters, but really did kind of stay out of it. When we're doing analysis, the other part of this is like domestic violence is like a prime example of something that's horrible, and sexual assault, by the way. Domestic violence and sexual, horribly underreported, right? So if I look and say, these are all the incidences of this taking place, right? It's like, no, it's not, right? And, estimates of how underreported like vary a bit. And there are a lot of cultural and external dynamics that like go into that underreporting, but it's important just to acknowledge it and know that we're always looking at a complete picture, but what we could look at is what we were doing and then what was coming out of the work that we were doing. Yeah.
That was super interesting. Thank you so much. And this is a somewhat different question, but I mean, the point at which you were kind of in this really interesting kind of position, within a national conversation and kind of also there's a scalar question there. I'm interested in sort of how you're thinking about the work you're doing changed as the sort of public discourse shifted since 2020. So thinking about the shift from like kind of a relatively broad recognition of kind of racial justice calls for police transparency shifting to sort of a more reactionary backlash against police reform, and how you're just in such an interesting kind of intersection of these processes. I'm interested in how that shifted for you.
We can think of reform as like a philosophy between restorative justice and tough on crime. It's kind of like the two extremes, right? If you will. And that works, right, to some degree or another, but it's really better to think about it. What is most efficient to getting outcomes that we want to have in our communities where we have healthy, strong, safe communities, right? And I think that's a better place to kind of be on that conversation. Chris mentioned that I've been doing some research going to prosecutors' offices across the country, right? And I'm, not going to LA or San Francisco or even Denver having these conversations. I'm going to Hannock County, Indiana, talking to the prosecutor there, who happens to be Republican and is one like the last 10 prosecutors were Republican. But he has limited budget, right? And he wants to use his resources as smartly as possible, and he cares about his community. So he might not want to be like, okay, I'm going to reform, but I want to know what's working, right? And I want to use data to do that. And I think to some degree or another, that analogy of a mirror, right? The more we become self-aware of how we exist in the world, right? Realize the impact of our actions, the better our actions should be, and the more thoughtful they're going to be, right? And I also don't want to say that every idea of reform is a great idea, you know? I think like they need to be tested as much as we need to test this kind of classical paradigm of tough on crime solves all the badness in the world. Sure.
I had a data question that when we're talking about restorative justice and to that question, what do you mean by what does the data do in the sense of is it to bring down violence? Do you prosecute more? Is it more cases? Does it mean in return that jail populations go high? And then do you measure that with what is the recidivism rate? Does that mean our numbers are higher? Currently, I know that the prosecution rate is higher. Pretrial detention is lower. And I know that the threshold for property crimes were raised up. In Kim Fox's era, it was a bit lower.
Yep.
So with that, how do you combat the wave of restorative justice?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is if we want to just look at countries, right? And then jail population based on the population of the country, America crushes it. I think we're like 3 times more than any other country there, right? But we're not as safe as most other countries, right? So, you know, that lack of correlation is enough to say we have to be more thoughtful about it. I think that, you know, to get philosophical, aside from the, you know, data side of things, the question of why do people do bad things is a big question that we're constantly struggling with, right? Personally, I think it's kind of a 3-legged stool that that leads to it. And you know, this is again completely theoretical, right? In the sense that I don't have the data to back it up. But one is lack of opportunity, right? So you know, this is a classic. I steal a loaf of bread to feed my family, right? Which you know happens to some degree or another in different forms or fashion. But lack of opportunity. One is lack of connection to self, right? And I look at this as mental health. I look at this as addiction. I look at this as people that are just willing to do something outlandish because they, you know, they're separated from their own humanity, for lack of better terminology. And then the third is lack of connection to their community. And you know, that's where you're willing to rob your neighbor or wrong your neighbor because you don't feel that closeness or connection. And I think that most people doing bad things aren't because people are inherently bad, right? But it's because they have some combination of these 3 drivers in them that are bubbling over in such a way that gets them to act in a certain way.
Thank you. Very insightful presentation, specifically in respect of how we are looking at definitions and counting as a basic measure. My question is with respect to the requirements of data balancing with too much of it. It seems contradictory in the sense that sometimes when I look at a lot of civil disputes and we have a lot of reporting requirements. And sometimes we joke around in office that, you know, we become a reporting service as opposed to actually delivering the job that we were hired to do. So how do you derive that fine balance where you need the reports to be able to make meaningful information, but at the same time, you're not constantly just juggling between those reports to...
Yeah. I you know, landing on a good data tool, right, that helps people do their work is truly an art form. It is definitely an iterative process. That memo that I'm very proud of, I should have pulled up an early version of it that looked way different. We included, our system had 88 different categories of cases, right? We included all 88, included dogfighting, right? Which God, you know, dogfighting is bad. I don't want to see dogfighting. We've had 1 case of dogfighting in the last 20 years in Cook County that's been led to a case, right? We didn't need to show that information, and that was overload, right? We need to kind of simplify it so people could actually understand and synthesize it. So I think it's very much about a narrative process, and then it's also knowing your audience, right? And so, you know, I kind of talked about what is that need, right? Start with the questions that are being asked and again, try to figure out your data assets to answer that question. I also don't think it's helpful to kind of this prediction question, right? Don't overplay your hand, right? With what your data can tell you, especially for executives, leaders, they want to be able to say definitively, this is gospel, right? And even like, I always like to tell a story about, before there was data, people would walk up to an oracle, right? And then they talk to the oracle and they come down and they tell the elders, like, this is what we're going to do. The oracle told me, right? And then we ended up creating a database called Oracle, right? And this is what we're going to do, right? And so we fight that urge, right? As much as possible. Like, again, dial in on the things you can count that you know for sure, right? If you need to answer a different question, if you're running a program and you need to know an outcome of it, well, then you need to record that outcome in some form or fashion, right? And so then it's like, okay, what can we do to record it? How well do we trust it? What's the training around recording it, right? How quickly can we get that data? This exists in like NGO development, across the country, as well as, running diversion programs in Cook County. Yes.
Thanks for your work. I remember reading your stuff on carjacking back when it came out, and I thought to myself, oh, wow, they're actually coming back with some data analytics to this nonsense. My question for you is, I was really compelled by the figure that you produced of the cycle of like, Fox News to like defensiveness. I've never seen it quite visualized that way, and it makes complete sense. And I guess my question is, can you speak to some of the strategies you had to take, almost like qualitative strategies you had to take in presenting the quantitative data to the elected officials? Because we know the power of Anecdote to stir the fear. But as you said, I would argue even sometimes counting is as obtuse as p-values, right? So like, what were some of the strategies that your offices discussed to take these really complex, obtuse ideas into something that they can feel resonates to combat against that narrative?
There were kind of a couple things on that end. We spent a lot of time discussing gun violence with CPD. And not surprisingly so, we were probably on different ends of that spectrum. And we would go into big meetings with lots of brass to kind of discuss this. And actually talked about nonviolent gun cases there. And they looked at me like I had like a fifth arm, right? Like they were just like, what do you mean nonviolent gun cases? It was like, like someone's holding a gun, just they're holding it. It's not violent to hold something, right? And they're like, they couldn't believe that whatsoever. It's a back and forth, right? You want to simplify, right? You again can come with lots of information. You're going to overwhelm. It's a process, right? It's an education process. It takes time. And then the other piece of it is, again, someone can come with a story and say, this happened and we know it happened. And CWB is a prime example of this, right? Ask them how often it's happening, right? Like count it. And CWB actually did count the number of violent crimes coming off of people that were out on bond. And they kept a running tracker of it. And I think the percentage that they had for the data they had was like about 3 to 5% or something of that nature. And now, now we're into a space of, is 3 to 5% of people out on bond committing violent crimes something we're comfortable with as a society? And that moves the conversation to a different space, right? And I don't necessarily know the answer for that, right? But at least we had the opportunity to say, okay, we're both looking at the same facts here, right? And so a little bit, get them to count their own things or to present that is a way to kind of help shape it. So, you had a question, a comment? Yeah.
Hi, thank you for this talk. Along a similar vein, I feel like a lot of the examples that we've talked about today are ones in which someone made an accusation about your office or said something, and then the data actually proved that you guys were doing what your mission was or what you were expected to do. Was there ever a scenario where the data showed that there was actually something going wrong in your office or something that didn't look good for you guys? I feel like people often want data transparency until it doesn't look good for them. And so I was just wondering if that ever happened.
Yeah, definitely. I think the biggest challenge internal conversation that we ever that was a reoccurring one were disparities that happened in our system that broke along race. And they're there. They were there. They got better under the Fox administration, but they were there. And the question is why, right? And if I talk to a prosecutor, the prosecutor is going to tell me, I don't consider the race of the person, right? I am just following the letter of the law, right? And you know, they treat every case like a snowflake, right? Like it's unique on its own. And they're probably generally accurate, right? But the challenge is that the rap sheet for the person that happens to live in a neighborhood that's over-policed is going to be longer than the rap sheet for a person that lives in a neighborhood that's not over-policed. Like that's just facts, right? And so from that standpoint, if that rap sheet is being factored in, right, independent of the person's race, it's playing out in decision-making that ultimately ends up shaping how people view a case should be resolved. And so these were the tensions, right? You know, I talked to like 4,000-year-old practice, right? 4,000 years old, right? Like that's older than most modern religions, you know, 200-year-old office, right? People doing this, right? And I will say this, that everyone that I interacted with at that office, right, was there because they cared about their community. They may have defined community slightly differently, right? And that's potentially problematic, you know, but it wasn't there because they had any behavior that I would consider predatory or that they wanted to challenge folks, right? That they were really trying to figure out how to make a better, safer community. Now, different philosophies, different opinions, right? And, you know, look, sometimes it's hard to look in the mirror and see something we don't like about ourselves. I'll be the first to admit it, right? I wish I was as sprightly as I was 20 years ago. And I'm not. I'm trying every day, but like this doesn't come back to me. So, yes.
Talking earlier about, thank you for a fantastic presentation. You were talking earlier about, you know, theories around different reasons that people might commit crime and you know, these different more theoretical ideas that might translate into policy goals. And those might not necessarily be like ideas that are represented in data reports about what crime looks like in criminal justice looks like in Chicago. I imagine working for an elected official, the whole office is, you know, in a position to be responsive to a lot of different people who have a lot of different opinions on criminal on criminal justice, and they might have you know, be interested in different response variables that all don't really tell a whole story of what's going on, be that like conviction rates or jail populations or whatever. And I'm wondering, like, as a data professional working for an elected official who's accountable to a lot of different people with different opinions on what should be happening that might not be super informed, how does that impact how you like select and present response variables? And I know you already talked about how like the framing is a really important part of this, but I imagine if someone's just like, oh, jail populations are down, that must mean that like these people are like not working hard enough or something like that. Like that's not the whole story.
Yeah. I mean, so there are a lot, like the biggest thing I looked at, and I should have included a slide on this, but look at where the accused in our data set, what zip code they live in, right? That like over indexes, like I think 5% of the individuals in our data were from Austin, zip code in Austin, if I recall correctly, right? Zip codes in Inglewood also over indexed, right? I think I could get to like 15% amongst like, I don't know, something like 10 zip codes, right? And I think there are 200 zip codes in Cook County, by the way. That just like gives you a sense of that. So now, like, what does that mean, right? Like let's unpack that a little bit. I think the other thing is about the data. People like often ask me like, what's the most interesting thing about the data, or what's the most shocking thing? I think like the first thing is 90% of the individuals in this data are male. And that tells me something about my society that I live in, right? Like, you know, I'm not 100% sure, but like we're doing something wrong with men in our society in some form or fashion. I don't like, you know, I don't know what the answer is, but that shows it. And then the other part of this is that, you know, 80% were African-American. And like that tells me something about how our society is probably structured there as well, that like we're not providing the opportunities that we should be, right? That we're creating pressures unnecessarily, you know? I don't think, most people believe that the character of someone is defined by genetics. I think that's like insane, quite frankly. But, why do we see genetics playing out so much in criminal justice data then? Got to be some other type of factor. Oh.
So thanks for the presentation, it was great. As I'm sure you know, one of the frustrations in the public sector of building these kind of data systems is what one administration is really interested in and focused on may not be what the next administration is. We can even see this, at the federal level, for example.
Sure.
So do you have thoughts on like how you make this stick, both the kind of cultural data, but also just, I don't know if you have thoughts about the data system itself and how it's being maintained and used under a new administration compared to the old, and what lessons you learned that might be helpful to people who are thinking about building these things.
Elections matter, right? Like vote, vote, vote. Like that's like the number one thing. I would say to anyone about this. I think that at the end of the day, the work isn't about one office or one elected official or one time frame that you're trying to change. It's a cultural movement, right? And it's, again, I truly believe that we will get better results if we use data to inform how we get results. That's just like a simple paradigm that I think works. So I want to make data cooler than it is. Now, the good news is the technology that's out there to build out a system like that is getting much, much better. Right? You can dump a very large data set into AI and it will definitely start spitting out some results. You gotta be a little bit cautious with it. You should know what you're doing when you do it. But like, when I first got into this, I was using Excel and it could only do 64,000 rows, right? And now my wife is a small business owner and she has a data warehouse that I built for her in Google that costs us a couple pennies a month, that integrates a bunch of different systems that she uses for a small business, and she can get a 360 view of her customer. And so, it is growing and changing, right? The University of Chicago is a prime example of when I was at the Obama campaign, I don't know if there were any quite data style roles at University of Chicago as far as degrees, programs, things of that nature. And now they're probably at least a dozen in some form or fashion. It's plugged into everything, right? Your MBA can be data centric, your public policy can be data centric. And so that culture is changing over and over again. And I think that's the big piece of it. As far as, generally holding elected officials accountable is by making noise and making that noise in such a way that they care about it. Kim Fox came in part because of the noise made around Laquan McDonald and Anita Alvarez and Rahm Emanuel, right? Kim Fox left because she wanted to go on to do other things. A new administration has come in there. There's not a Laquan McDonald situation, thank God, that's elevating people to challenge a current administration, and that's fine. I wouldn't wish for that. But if people want to see something different by that administration, more transparency, you got to make noise about it, right? And get people involved in it. And it may not happen, and that's okay as well. Others are going to start using data, and at the end of the day, those that run budgets will care about data because then they can run budgets more efficiently, and that's really the major driver of all of it. So, yes.
Yeah, I've got a question that's kind of, oh, sure. Thanks. Yeah, my question is kind of a follow-up to a number of them that have been asked so far. I was a little bit, I was struck by this image of the kind of news stories which appear within hours of one another, but I was a little bit surprised to hear you sort of imply that you feel like it's your role to kind of intervene in that news cycle, with digital publishing that's happening so quickly, to say nothing of like social media.
Sure.
I see what you're doing as much more like long form journalism. You yourself said like these reports take, months to process. So I guess I'm curious to hear you say a little bit more about like balancing that desire to sort of be useful to your boss who is in the thick of things and probably does need to respond to the news cycle, and yet also to take the time to actually produce the good work, which is extremely difficult, as you outlined so thoroughly.
So having helpers are like great, and building smart tools. So one of the tools that we built was actually a dashboard that allowed any user that had access to it to select a date range, and then it had multiple pages of broad categories in normal language of different types of crimes our office handled, so that they could then go and share data with reporters and press as quickly as they needed to. And they didn't need me to do that, right? It was essentially like in the world of data governance, like terms, it's like gold quality data that was available for our end user to just be able to hand out. And we actually went so far as to not just show the number, but plug the number into a sentence that they could copy and paste and put into an email that got it exactly right, so that there was no, yes, things could get lost in translation, but really like we tried to put controls around it. So there were lost in translation. We got there because we looked at the data about the data questions we were being asked, right? And saw like, okay, these are our common themes. These are the things we want to be able to answer. So here's how we can put this together in such a way to answer it. And so, that getting there was a long process. And that meant I deprioritized looking at diversion and recidivism, right? Which is also very important long term. That's the, long form journalism question. But getting it stood up meant that then I didn't have to answer as many small questions, so that I could then dig into how recidivism was playing out for those that had gone through diversion.
I think we're at our time, and so before we thank Matthew again, I do want to remind you, there'll be a webinar tomorrow if you're interested.
Wednesday.
What's today? Yes, Wednesday, not tomorrow. To learn a little bit more about this hackathon. And if you're interested in joining the hackathon, that's on November 7th. You'll be able to get your hands on this data, ask your own questions, do your own analyses. So please take advantage of that if you're interested, and we'll have like some people there to help you. You need some basic data skills, but you don't have to be a PhD in machine learning. Hopefully many of you will take advantage of that and see Matthew again. But in the meantime, thank you for a great presentation.